The funeral was small, quiet, just like Daniel Nietzsche had lived his last 30 years. A handful of relatives gathered under the Arizona sun at the San Carlos Apache Reservation Cemetery, where red dust clung to polished shoes and the wind carried the scent of sage across the barren hills. Sarah Nietzsche stood beside the simple wooden casket, her hand resting on her son Tommy's shoulder, both wearing expressions caught between grief and something else, something unfinished. Her father had been a man of few words, a shadow in his own home, present but never fully there. He fixed fences, tended horses, carved small wooden figures he never sold, and when anyone asked about his past, he would simply say he did what needed doing, and nothing more. For 70 years that was enough of an answer, or at least it had to be. Sarah had grown up believing her father was just a quiet man, maybe even a broken one, someone the world had passed by without much notice. She never knew why he flinched at loud noises, why he refused to watch war movies, why every 4th of July he would disappear into the desert alone and return only after the fireworks ended. She never knew because he never told her, and after a while, she stopped asking. It was easier that way, easier to let the silence fill the spaces between them than to push against a wall that would never move. But now, standing over his grave, she felt the weight of all those unanswered questions pressing down like stones on her chest. The service was brief. A local pastor spoke about Daniel's love for the land, his skill with horses, his quiet generosity. A few elders from the tribe nodded respectfully, their faces carved with the same kind of silence Daniel had carried. Then, just as the casket was being lowered, a black sedan pulled up along the dirt road. 2 men in military dress uniforms stepped out, their shoes shining even through the dust, their faces solemn and practiced. Sarah's breath caught. She glanced at Tommy, who looked equally confused. The soldiers approached slowly, reverently, carrying a folded American flag with white-gloved hands. One of them, a young man with a square jaw and kind eyes, stopped in front of Sarah and spoke in a voice that carried across the cemetery like a bell. On behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service. Sarah took the flag, its weight surprising, its fabric crisp and cold against her fingers. She stared at it, then at the soldiers, then back at the flag, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Her father a veteran? Her father honored by the military? The soldiers saluted, held the gesture for a long moment, then turned and walked back to their car. The engine started, the sedan rolled away, and Sarah was left standing there holding a flag she didn't understand, representing a life she never knew existed. After the burial, the small gathering moved to the community center for a modest meal. Sarah sat at a corner table, the folded flag resting in her lap, untouched food growing cold on a paper plate beside her. Tommy sat across from her, his phone out. Already searching? Mom, I'm looking up his name in military records. There has to be something. Sarah nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the triangle of fabric, the white stars against blue, the red and white stripes. How could she have lived 42 years as his daughter and not known this? How could he have carried the secret to his grave without ever once letting it slip? An elderly woman approached the table, moving slowly with the help of a wooden cane. It was Maria Gosayun, one of the oldest members of the tribe, a keeper of stories and traditions. Her face was a map of deep lines, her eyes sharp, despite her 95 years. She lowered herself into the chair beside Sarah with a soft grunt. Your father was a good man. Sarah looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you know? Did you know he was in the war? Maria's expression didn't change. Many of our men went to that war. Not all of them came back. Those who did, most chose not to speak of it. It is our way. To boast of one's deeds is to dishonor them. To carry pain silently is to protect those you love. Sarah's throat tightened. But he never told me anything. Not one story. Not one memory. How am I supposed to understand who he was if he never let me in? Maria reached out and placed a weathered hand over Sarah's. You are understanding now. That is why he kept silent. Some truths are too heavy to share while you are still breathing. He gave you peace by keeping his war to himself. But now that he is gone, the war can speak, and you can listen without him having to watch you carry the weight he carried. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Maria squeezed her hand once, then stood and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with the flag and a growing need to know. Tommy's voice broke the silence. "Mom, I found something." Sarah leaned forward. He was part of the 36th Infantry Division, deployed to North Africa in 1943, then Italy. He was listed as a scout and tracker. There are records of commendations, but most of the details are still classified or just not digitized. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Classified? Why would his service be classified? Tommy shook his head. "I don't know, but there's a name here, someone who served in the same unit. A James Crawford. He's still alive, living in Virginia. There's a phone number." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in Tucson, the flag spread out before her phone in her hand. She had called the number Tommy found, left a voicemail explaining who she was, asking if James Crawford remembered Daniel Nietzsche. Now she waited, the silence of her house pressing in like the silence her father had always carried. She thought about his hands, calloused and strong, always busy with some small task. She thought about the way he would stare at the horizon for long stretches, as if seeing something no one else could see. She thought about the wooden figures he carved, always animals, always in motion, fleeing or hunting, never at rest. She remembered a specific afternoon from her childhood. Maybe she was 8 or 9 years old. Her father had been sitting on the porch, knife in hand, a piece of pine wood slowly taking the shape of a running deer. She had asked him why he always carved animals running. He had paused, the knife suspended in air, his eyes distant. "Because standing still gets you killed," he had said, then returned to his work without elaboration. At the time she thought it was just a strange thing to say. Now sitting in her kitchen decades later, she wondered if he had been talking about the war, about survival, about the instinct to keep moving that had kept him alive when so many others had died. The phone rang at 7 in the morning. Sarah grabbed it before the second ring. "This is James Crawford. You called about Daniel Nietzsche." His voice was gravelly, aged, but steady. "Yes," Sarah said, her words tumbling out. "I'm his daughter. He passed away 3 days ago. I didn't know he served until his funeral. I need to know who my father was." There was a long pause on the other end, the sound of breath drawn in and held. Then quietly he said, "Your father saved my life more times than I can count. If you want to know who he was, you'll need to sit down. This isn't a short story." Sarah pulled out a chair, grabbed a pen and notebook and said, "I'm ready." Crawford began. "I met Daniel in North Africa, 1943. We were part of a reconnaissance unit, moving ahead of the main force, mapping terrain, identifying enemy positions. Daniel was brought in as a tracker, one of several Native American soldiers assigned to units that needed their skills. At first, some of the men didn't take him seriously. They saw him as just another Indian, quiet, kept to himself. But that changed fast. Daniel could read the land like it was a book written just for him. He could tell you if someone had passed through an area hours before, what direction they went, how many there were, even if they were carrying heavy equipment. It was like magic, except it wasn't magic. It was knowledge. Generations of knowledge passed down, and he used it to keep us alive. Crawford's voice took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing the past play out before his eyes. North Africa was hell. Heat like you wouldn't believe. Sand in everything and an enemy that knew the terrain better than we did. But Daniel, he adapted faster than anyone. He studied the land, learned to read the way wind moved the sand, how to spot disturbed ground that others would walk right past. One time we were moving through a wadi, a dry riverbed, and Daniel stopped us dead. He knelt down, touched the ground, smelled the dirt. Then he said, "Mines." We thought he was crazy. There were no visible signs, no markers, nothing. But he insisted. We called in the engineers, and sure enough, the whole area was laced with anti-personnel mines. If we'd kept walking, half the squad would have been killed. After that, nobody questioned Daniel again. Sarah scribbled notes frantically, her hand struggling to keep up. Crawford continued. We were in Italy by late 1943, pushing north through mountains and mud. The terrain was brutal. The Germans dug in deep. Our unit was tasked with moving behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply routes. Daniel led most of those missions. He moved through the mountains like a ghost, never made a sound, never left a trace. I remember one night we were pinned down in a valley. Enemy patrol closing in from 3 sides. Daniel disappeared into the darkness, and we thought he'd run. Thought we were done for. 20 minutes later, the patrol just stopped, turned around, and left. We found out later Daniel had circled behind them, left false trails leading away from us, made it look like a larger force was moving in from the east. He didn't fire a single shot. He just used the land, used their fear, and saved 12 men without them ever knowing he was there. Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote, "Why didn't he ever talk about this? Why keep it secret?" Crawford sighed, a long, weary sound. A lot of reasons. Some of it was cultural, I think. Daniel once told me that in his tribe, talking about your own bravery was considered shameful. You did what needed doing, and that was the end of it. But there was more. After the war, when we came home, things were different for him than they were for me. I got parades, benefits, people thanking me for my service. Daniel went back to a reservation where nothing had changed, where the government still controlled every aspect of life, where he was still treated like a second-class citizen. He told me once, and I'll never forget this, he said, "I fought for a country that didn't fight for me, and I don't know how to make sense of that." So he stopped trying. He just went quiet and stayed that way. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, not at her father, but at the world that had silenced him. What else did he do? What else should I know? Crawford's voice grew softer, more careful. There was a mission in 1944, winter, up in the mountains near Monte Cassino. Our unit was sent to locate a German artillery position that was tearing our lines apart. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. The terrain was impossible, sheer cliffs and ice, and the Germans had the high ground. We lost 3 men in the first hour, picked off by snipers we couldn't even see. The captain was ready to pull back, call in air support, but Daniel volunteered to go ahead alone, scout the position, find a way in. The captain tried to stop him, said it was too dangerous, but Daniel just looked at him and said, "I've climbed worse mountains for less important reasons." And then he was gone. Crawford paused, and Sarah could hear him swallowing hard. He was gone for 2 days. We thought he was dead. The weather turned worse, snow and wind, visibility down to nothing. We set up a defensive position and waited, expecting the worst. Then, on the 3rd night, the artillery went silent. Just stopped, middle of a barrage, complete silence. We didn't know what to make of it. At dawn, we moved in cautiously, expecting an ambush. We found the position abandoned, equipment destroyed, ammunition scattered, no sign of the enemy. And then we found Daniel a mile away, slumped against a tree, barely conscious, covered in blood. Some of it was his, most of it wasn't. He had a bullet wound in his shoulder, frostbite on his hands and feet, and cuts all over from climbing bare rock in the dark. "What happened up there?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Crawford's answer was slow, measured. He never told us the full story. Never. But we pieced together what we could. There were 8 German soldiers dead in that artillery position, and every piece of equipment was sabotaged beyond repair. The way the bodies were positioned, the way the equipment was destroyed, it was clear it wasn't a firefight. It was surgical. Daniel had gone in alone, in the middle of a blizzard, climbed a mountain that should have been unclimbable, infiltrated an enemy position, eliminated the threat, and destroyed their capability to continue. And he did it without backup, without air support, without anything but his knife, his rifle, and the skills his grandfather had taught him as a boy. The Army gave him a Silver Star for that mission, one of the highest decorations you can receive. But Daniel refused to attend the ceremony. He said he didn't want a medal for doing what any soldier would do. They mailed it to him. I don't know if he ever even opened it. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. A Silver Star. Her father had earned one of the military's highest honors, and she had never known. Tommy, who had been listening on speaker, leaned forward, his face pale. "Mr. Crawford, do you know if there are any records, any documents we can access?" Crawford replied, "Most of the detailed mission reports were classified for decades, some because of the nature of the operations, others just because of bureaucratic oversight. Some have been declassified now, but you'll need to request them through the National Archives. It can take months, sometimes years. I can send you what I have. Letters, a few photos, some notes I kept." I stayed in touch with Daniel over the years, sent him letters every Christmas, called a few times. He never said much, but he always listened. I think he appreciated knowing someone remembered, that someone knew who he really was, even if he couldn't talk about it. After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence. The notebook filled with her father's hidden life spread before her. Tommy broke the quiet, his voice shaky. "Mom, we need to find that silver star. We need to find everything. We need to understand." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. That afternoon they drove back to the reservation, to her father's small house, the place where he had lived alone for the last 15 years after her mother passed. The house was exactly as he had left it. Simple, clean, everything in its place. They began searching methodically, opening drawers, checking closets, looking for anything that might reveal more of the man they thought they knew. It was Tommy who found the box. It was in the back of the bedroom closet, behind stacks of old blankets and worn boots. A simple shoebox, unmarked, covered in dust. He pulled it out carefully and brought it to the small kitchen table where Sarah was sitting. They looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement of the moment, then Sarah lifted the lid. Inside was a life her father had never shared. The silver star was there, still in its original case, the ribbon faded but the metal itself gleaming as if it had been polished recently. Beside it were letters, dozens of them, tied with string. Letters from James Crawford, from other soldiers, from commanding officers. There were photographs, black and white images of young men in uniform, Daniel among them, always standing slightly apart, his expression serious, his eyes guarded. There were other objects too. A German officer's compass, the brass tarnished but the glass intact. A piece of shrapnel, jagged and heavy, with a small tag attached that read, Monte Cassino, February 1944. A worn map of Italy, folded and refolded so many times the creases had torn, with pencil marks tracing routes through mountains and valleys. A small notebook filled with Daniel's handwriting, entries brief and factual, recording dates, locations, weather conditions. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just the bare facts of missions completed and men lost. Each item was a fragment of a life Sarah had never known, a life her father had locked away so completely that even those closest to him had no idea it existed. Sarah picked up one of the letters, the paper yellowed and brittle. It was from Crawford, dated December 1946, 2 years after the war ended. The handwriting was neat, careful. "Daniel, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to reach out, see how you're doing. I'm back in Virginia trying to settle into civilian life. It's harder than I thought it would be. People here don't understand, don't want to hear about what we went through. They want to move on, pretend it never happened. But I can't forget, and I don't think you can either. I think about that night in the valley, the mission at Monte Cassino, all the times you kept us alive when we should have died. I wanted you to know that I remember, that I'm grateful, that your service mattered even if nobody else seems to care. Write back if you can. Your friend James." Sarah read the letter aloud, her voice breaking. Tommy listened, his jaw tight. Did he ever write back? Sarah shuffled through the letters, found one in her father's handwriting, dated January 1947. The writing was sparse, almost reluctant. "James, got your letter. Glad you made it home safe. Things here are the same as they always were. Working on the reservation, helping with horses. People don't ask about the war and I don't bring it up. Maybe that's for the best. I think about those days too, but I try not to. Remembering doesn't change anything. Take care of yourself, Daniel." The letter was short, almost cold, but Sarah could read between the lines. Her father had been struggling, trying to reconcile the man he had been in the war with the man he was expected to be at home. They spent hours going through the box, reading letters, studying photographs, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from fragments. One photograph showed Daniel standing beside a military jeep, mountains rising behind him, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked young, maybe 23 or 24, his face lean and hard, his eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. This was not the father she remembered, the quiet man who carved animals and avoided conversation. This was a warrior, someone who had seen death and dealt it, someone who carried the weight of survival. Another photograph showed a group of soldiers sitting around a campfire, their faces exhausted but relieved. Daniel was at the edge of the group, as always, his gaze turned away from the camera, looking out into the darkness beyond the firelight. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "After Monte Cassino, March 1944. We made it." Sarah stared at the image, trying to imagine what her father had felt in that moment, sitting with men who knew what he had done, men who owed their lives to his courage. Had he felt pride, relief, or just the hollow emptiness that comes after surviving something that should have killed you? Tommy found a small leather pouch tucked into the corner of the box. Inside were military dog tags, Daniel's name stamped into the metal along with a serial number and blood type. There was also a dried flower, brittle and colorless, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Sarah unwrapped it gently, afraid it would crumble at her touch. A note was folded beneath it, written in a woman's handwriting. "Daniel, I know you're leaving soon. I wanted you to have this, a piece of home to carry with you. Come back safe." The note was unsigned, but Sarah recognized the handwriting. It was her grandmother's, Daniel's mother, who had died when Sarah was very young. The flower must have been from the reservation, something his mother had given him before he deployed, a talisman of protection and love. Sarah's tears fell onto the table, and she didn't wipe them away. Her father had carried this flower through North Africa, through Italy, through every mission and battle, keeping it safe, keeping it close. And when he came home, he had put it in a box and never looked at it again, sealing away not just the war but the hope and love that had sustained him through it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just hidden his service. He had hidden his pain, his fear, his vulnerability, everything that made him human, because he believed that was the only way to protect his family from the darkness he carried. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Tommy dove deeper into research. They requested military records from the National Archives, filling out forms, providing documentation, waiting for responses that came slowly, bureaucratically. They contacted veteran organizations, tribal historical societies, anyone who might have information about Apache soldiers in World War II. Slowly, piece by piece, Daniel Nietzsche's war emerged from the shadows. They found commendations, official documents praising his skill and bravery, mission reports with his name sometimes included, sometimes redacted, but descriptions matching Crawford's stories. They found photographs in military archives, images of reconnaissance units, Daniel's face appearing in several, always serious, always watchful. They discovered that Daniel had not been alone. The 36th Infantry Division had included several Native American soldiers, men from different tribes who had been recruited specifically for their tracking and survival skills. Some had served as scouts like Daniel, others as communication specialists, a few as code talkers, though not as famously as the Navajo. Almost all of them had returned to lives of quiet obscurity, their service unrecognized by the broader public, their sacrifices forgotten or overlooked. Sarah began reaching out to other families, connecting with sons and daughters and grandchildren who had similar stories, fathers and grandfathers who had served in silence, who had carried the war alone until their deaths. One woman Sarah spoke with, the daughter of a Navajo code talker, told her that her father had also refused to talk about the war for decades. It wasn't until the code talkers were officially recognized in the 1960s that he finally opened up, and even then, he shared only fragments, pieces of a story too painful to tell in full. She said that for many Native American veterans, the silence was a form of survival, a way to cope with the contradiction of fighting for a country that had tried to destroy their culture. They had served with honor, but they came home to reservations where poverty, discrimination, and government control were still the reality. Talking about their service felt like acknowledging a betrayal, either of their country or their people, and so they chose silence as the only safe path. Sarah found this explanation both heartbreaking and illuminating. Her father's silence hadn't been about shame or weakness. It had been about survival, about finding a way to live with contradictions that had no easy resolution. He had been a warrior in the Apache tradition, using skills passed down through generations to protect and defend. But he had also been a soldier in an army that represented a government responsible for the suffering of his people. How do you reconcile those identities? How do you talk about courage and sacrifice when the country you fought for still treats you as less than equal? For Daniel, the answer had been silence. And now, decades later, his daughter was finally beginning to understand why. Tommy's research led him to a historian at Arizona State University who specialized in Native American military history, Dr. Ellen Marsh had spent years documenting the service of Indigenous soldiers, collecting oral histories, digitizing records, advocating for recognition. When Tommy contacted her and explained his grandfather's story, she immediately offered to help. They met at her office in Tempe, a small room overflowing with books, maps, and filing cabinets stuffed with documents. Dr. Marsh listened intently as Tommy and Sarah shared what they had learned, occasionally taking notes, nodding with recognition. When they finished, Dr. Marsh leaned back in her chair and said, "Your grandfather's story is not unique, but that doesn't make it any less important. Thousands of Native American men served in World War II, and the vast majority came home to nothing. No parades, no recognition, no benefits. Many were denied veteran services because of bureaucratic errors or outright discrimination. Some were told they didn't qualify for the GI Bill because they lived on reservations. Others were simply ignored. The silence you're describing, the refusal to talk about the war, it's a pattern I've seen over and over. These men served with extraordinary courage, but they came home to a country that didn't value their sacrifice. So they internalized it, locked it away, and tried to move on. But trauma doesn't just disappear. It sits inside you, shaping everything you do, even if you never speak of it." Dr. Marsh pulled out a folder and handed it to Sarah. Inside were copies of documents she had collected over the years, records of Apache soldiers who had served in various capacities during the war. Daniel's name appeared in several, listed among scouts attached to the 36th Infantry Division, mentioned in after-action reports, noted in commendation lists. There were also photographs Dr. Marsh had obtained from military archives, images Sarah and Tommy hadn't seen before. One showed Daniel leading a patrol through a forest, his eyes scanning the trees, his body tense and alert. Another showed him sitting with other scouts, cleaning weapons, preparing for a mission. In every image, he looked focused, competent, a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Dr. Marsh also shared stories of other Apache veterans, men whose families had discovered their service only after their deaths. One man, a scout named Henry Peso, had served in the Pacific, using his tracking skills to hunt Japanese soldiers in the jungles of the Philippines. He had earned a Bronze Star, but never mentioned it to his family. They found the medal in a box after his funeral, along with letters from fellow soldiers describing his bravery. Another man, Robert Lupe, had served as a medic in Europe, saving lives under fire, earning multiple commendations. He came home and worked as a janitor at a school on the reservation, never once mentioning his military service. His children only learned about it when a former comrade showed up at his funeral and told them their father was a hero. These stories gave Sarah context, helped her see that her father's silence was part of a larger pattern, a collective response to collective trauma, but they also made her angry. Why had these men been forgotten? Why had their service been erased from history? Why did their families have to discover their sacrifices after they were gone, when it was too late to thank them, to honor them, to let them know their service mattered? Dr. Marsh didn't have easy answers. She explained that the erasure was partly intentional, a result of systemic racism and government policies that devalued Indigenous lives, and partly accidental, a consequence of poor record-keeping and bureaucratic indifference. But regardless of the reasons, the result was the same. Thousands of Native American veterans had been forgotten, and their stories were in danger of being lost forever. Determined to prevent that loss, Sarah and Tommy decided to hold a second ceremony for Daniel, a proper military honor that would acknowledge his service publicly and give the community a chance to remember not just him, but all the Apache veterans who had served in silence. They worked with tribal leaders, veteran organizations, and the Department of Defense to organize the event. It took months of planning, navigating bureaucracy, coordinating schedules, but finally, a date was set. The ceremony would be held at the San Carlos Reservation Community Center, open to anyone who wanted to attend. The day of the ceremony arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. The community center was filled with people, far more than had attended Daniel's funeral. Tribal elders sat in the front rows, their faces solemn and respectful. Veterans from various wars, some in uniform, others in traditional dress, lined the sides of the room. Families who had discovered similar stories about their own relatives came to honor Daniel and, through him, their own loved ones. Local news crews set up cameras, reporters taking notes. The story of the silent Apache veteran finally being told. Sarah stood at the front of the room, the silver star displayed on a table beside a large photograph of her father in uniform. She had prepared remarks, written and rewritten them dozens of times, trying to find words that could capture what she felt. When the room quieted, she began. My father, Daniel Gray Eagle Nietzsche, served his country with honor and courage. He was a scout and tracker in the 36th Infantry Division, deployed to North Africa and Italy during World War II. He led reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, saved the lives of countless soldiers, and earned one of the military's highest decorations, the Silver Star. But he never told us. He carried his service in silence for 70 years, protecting us from the weight of his experiences. Today, we honor not just his bravery in war, but his strength in peace, his choice to live quietly, to love deeply, and to let his actions speak louder than any words ever could. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. I spent my whole life wondering why my father was so distant, why he seemed to carry a sadness that never lifted. Now I know. He wasn't distant because he didn't love us. He was distant because he loved us too much to let us see the scars he carried. He fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. He returned to a reservation where his service went unrecognized, where he was still treated as less than equal. And yet he never complained, never demanded recognition, never asked for anything in return. He simply lived his life, raised his family, and carried his pain alone. That is the definition of strength. That is the definition of sacrifice. And that is why we are here today, to finally give him the recognition he deserved but never sought. The room erupted in applause, people standing, some wiping tears, others nodding in agreement. A representative from the Department of Defense stepped forward, presenting Sarah with additional commendations that had been lost in bureaucratic delays, medals Daniel had earned but never received. A bronze star for valor in North Africa, a Purple Heart for wounds received in Italy, campaign medals, service ribbons, each one a testament to a life of service that had been hidden for decades. Sarah accepted each one, her hands shaking, her heart full of pride and sorrow. James Crawford had flown in from Virginia to attend the ceremony. He was in his 90s now, frail but determined, his eyes still sharp. When Sarah invited him to speak, he walked slowly to the front, leaning on a cane, his voice wavering but strong. I served with Daniel Nietzsche for 2 years, and in that time, he saved my life more times than I can count. He was the bravest man I ever knew, and the most humble. He never asked for recognition, never sought glory. He just did what needed doing, and he did it better than anyone else. When we came home, I tried to stay in touch to let him know that someone remembered, that someone cared. But I don't think I ever truly understood what he was going through, the burden he was carrying. I wish I had done more. I wish I had insisted that his service be recognized while he was still alive. But I can't change the past. All I can do is stand here today and tell you that Daniel Nietzsche was a hero, and he deserves to be remembered as one. Crawford's words hung in the air, heavy with regret and respect. The ceremony continued with traditional Apache songs, prayers spoken in the native language, and an honor guard presenting arms. When it was over, people lined up to speak with Sarah and Tommy, sharing their own stories, thanking them for bringing Daniel's service to light, expressing hope that other forgotten veterans would finally be recognized. The local news coverage sparked broader interest, and within days the story had spread beyond Arizona. National news outlets picked it up, historians and researchers reached out, and suddenly, Daniel Nietzsche's name was being spoken in contexts he never could have imagined. Tommy threw himself into expanding his research, determined to document not just his grandfather's story, but the stories of all Apache veterans who had served in silence. He created an online archive, a digital repository where families could upload photographs, letters, documents, anything that preserved the memory of their loved ones. He conducted interviews with surviving veterans and their families, recording oral histories before they were lost forever. He partnered with Dr. Marsh and other historians to cross-reference military records with tribal records, identifying men whose service had gone unrecognized. The project grew beyond anything he had initially imagined, becoming a movement to honor all Native American veterans who had been forgotten. Sarah received letters from across the country, from families who had discovered similar secrets after their loved ones passed. One letter came from a woman in New Mexico, whose father, also an Apache veteran, had served in the Pacific. She wrote that her father had never spoken of the war, had refused all attempts to discuss it, and had died without ever sharing his experiences. After his death, she found a box similar to the one Sarah had found, filled with medals, letters, and photographs. She thanked Sarah for making it acceptable to ask questions, for showing that the silence could be broken without dishonoring the memory of those who had kept it. Another letter came from a man in Oklahoma, whose grandfather, a Kiowa scout, had served in Europe. He wrote that his grandfather had been denied veterans' benefits after the war, told that his service didn't qualify because he had been attached to a unit rather than formally enlisted. The family had fought the decision for years, eventually giving up in frustration. Now, inspired by Sarah's story, he was reopening the case, demanding that his grandfather's service be officially recognized. He enclosed copies of documents, photographs, and letters, asking if Sarah could help him navigate the bureaucracy. She agreed without hesitation, and together they worked through the process, eventually securing the recognition his grandfather had been denied for 70 years. The documentary Tommy had been working on premiered at a film festival in Santa Fe 2 years after Daniel's death. The film was titled Silent Warriors, Apache Scouts in World War II, and it told the story of men like Daniel who had used traditional skills to fight a modern war. The film didn't shy away from the contradictions and pain, the reality of serving a government that had oppressed their people, the silence that followed their return, but it also celebrated their courage, their skill, their unshakable sense of duty. The film featured interviews with surviving veterans, family members, historians, and military officials. James Crawford appeared prominently, recounting missions and battles, his voice filled with respect and admiration for the men he had served with. Daniel's story was the heart of the film, his photograph appearing throughout, his voice represented through letters and the memories of those who had known him. Sarah narrated parts of the film, reading from her father's sparse journal entries, sharing her journey from ignorance to understanding. The film's climax was the second ceremony at the reservation, the moment when Daniel's service was finally recognized, when his silence was finally broken. The audience at the premiere sat in stunned silence as the credits rolled, then erupted into applause that lasted several minutes. Sarah and Tommy stood on stage, overwhelmed by the response, grateful that their father and grandfather's story had touched so many. The film sparked a broader conversation about Native American veterans, leading to new recognition programs, scholarship funds for descendants of indigenous soldiers, and memorial projects across the country. The Department of Defense announced an initiative to review records and identify Native American veterans whose service had gone unrecognized, promising to correct historical oversights and provide proper honors. Tribal nations began their own documentation projects, creating archives and memorials to honor their warriors. The movement that had started with one family's discovery of a hidden life had grown into a national effort to ensure that no veteran's service would be forgotten again. A statue was commissioned for the San Carlos Reservation, designed by a Native American artist who had served in the military himself. The statue depicted an Apache scout in World War II uniform, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture alert and ready. The figure was cast in bronze, standing 8 feet tall on a granite base. The inscription read, "In honor of those who served in silence, Apache warriors of World War II." Below the inscription were names, dozens of them, Apache men who had served and returned to lives of quiet obscurity. Daniel Gray Eagle Naiche was among the first listed, his name carved into stone, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. The unveiling ceremony drew hundreds of people, tribal members, veterans, government officials, and families who had come to honor their own relatives. Maria Goseyun, now past 100 years old, was given the honor of pulling the cloth from the statue. Her hands shook with age, but her voice was strong and clear. These men carried 2 worlds within them, the world of their ancestors, the skills and knowledge passed down through generations, and the world of a nation that did not always see their worth. They served with honor and they returned with grace. We remember them now, not because they asked to be remembered, but because their silence has finally earned the right to be broken. May their names be spoken with pride, and may their sacrifices never be forgotten. The cloth fell away, revealing the statue, and the crowd erupted in applause and traditional songs. Sarah stood with Tommy and his daughter Daniela, 3 generations united in honoring the man who had started it all. Daniela, now 10 years old, had grown up hearing stories of her great-grandfather, learning about his courage and his silence. She had learned to carve, practicing with her grandmother, creating small wooden figures just as Daniel had done. She understood, in the way children sometimes do, that her great-grandfather had been both strong and broken, both a warrior and a man who had needed protection from his own memories. After the ceremony, Sarah walked to her father's grave, now marked with a military headstone that read, Daniel Gray Eagle Naicha, U.S. Army, World War II, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. The list of honors seemed inadequate, too small to capture the fullness of his service, but it was more than he had ever asked for. She placed a hand on the stone, still warm from the afternoon sun. I understand now, Dad. I understand why you stayed quiet. I understand what you were protecting us from. But I want you to know that we're not afraid of your story. We're proud of it. We're proud of you. Your silence kept us safe, but your service made us free. Thank you for both. Tommy knelt beside the grave, placing a wooden carving there, an eagle in flight, wings spread wide. He had made it himself, the craftsmanship improving with practice, the lines cleaner, the proportions more accurate. It was a tribute to his grandfather, a symbol of freedom and strength, a promise that the skills and traditions Daniel had carried would not be lost. Daniela knelt beside her father and placed her own carving, a small horse running across an open plain. Her work was still rough, the lines uncertain, but it was made with love and respect, and that was what mattered. The three of them stood together in silence, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust across the cemetery. In the distance, the statue stood tall, a sentinel watching over the reservation, a reminder that some silences, once broken, reveal truths that change everything. Daniel Naiche had lived 2 lives, one in war and one in peace, and for 70 years he had kept them separate, protecting his family from the weight of his experiences. But now, finally, those lives had merged, and his family understood the fullness of who he had been, a warrior, a father, a man who had carried his pain alone so that others could live in peace. Sarah continued her father's tradition of carving, taking up the tools he had left behind, practicing until her hands learned the rhythms he had known. She carved animals in motion, just as he had, each one a small act of creation, a way to honor his memory. She gave her carvings to family members, to friends, to people who had been touched by Daniel's story. Each piece carried a message, that silence is not always weakness, that love sometimes means bearing burdens alone, that the truest strength is often invisible until it is finally revealed. Tommy's archive continued to grow, becoming a comprehensive database of Native American veterans from all wars, not just World War II. Families from across the country contributed, uploading photographs, documents, stories. The archive became a resource for historians, educators, and researchers, a place where forgotten sacrifices were finally remembered. Tommy gave presentations at schools and universities, sharing his grandfather's story, explaining the cultural and historical context that had led to so much silence. He became an advocate for veterans' rights, pushing for policies that ensured all soldiers, regardless of race or background, received the recognition and benefits they deserved. Daniela grew up immersed in her great-grandfather's legacy, learning not just the facts of his service but the deeper lessons his life taught. She learned that courage comes in many forms, that sacrifice is not always visible, that the strongest people are sometimes the quietest. She learned to value her Apache heritage, to understand the traditions and knowledge that had been passed down through generations. And she learned that stories matter, that remembering is an act of love, that breaking silence can be a way of honoring those who kept it. Years passed, and Sarah grew older, her hair turning gray, her hands growing less steady, but she never stopped carving, never stopped telling her father's story. She became a keeper of memory, a bridge between generations, ensuring that Daniel Gray Eagle Naiche would never be forgotten. She spoke at veteran events, tribal gatherings, schools, anywhere people would listen. She told them about the silent warrior who had saved lives and earned medals but never sought recognition. She told them about the father who had protected his family by carrying his pain alone. And she told them that silence, when finally broken, can reveal truths that change the world. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, Sarah returned to the cemetery, as she did every year. The grave was well tended, flowers placed by visitors who had been moved by his story, small tokens left by strangers who felt connected to a man they had never met. She sat on the ground beside the headstone, her old bones protesting, and spoke to her father as if he were sitting beside her. "We did it, Dad. We told your story. We made sure people remember. And I hope, that you would be proud. Not of the medals or the recognition. I know you never cared about those. But proud that your silence finally has meaning, that your sacrifice is finally understood. You gave us peace by keeping the war to yourself, and now we're giving you peace by making sure you're never forgotten." The wind picked up, carrying dust and sage across the hills. And for a moment, Sarah felt her father's presence not as a ghost, but as a memory finally given its proper weight. She closed her eyes and let the wind wash over her, feeling connected to something larger than herself, a legacy of courage and sacrifice that stretched back through generations and would continue forward through her son and granddaughter. Daniel Gray Eagle Naiche had lived in silence, but his story now spoke with a voice that could not be ignored, a testament to the strength of those who serve without seeking glory, who protect without demanding recognition, who love by bearing burdens alone. If you found this story moving, please subscribe to our channel for more untold histories of courage and sacrifice. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own family stories of veterans who served in silence. Hit the like button to help us bring these forgotten stories to light and ensure that no soldier's service is ever overlooked again. These veterans deserve to be remembered, and your support makes that mission possible. Thank you for listening and thank you for honoring their legacy.